I'm here with Jonathan Ehrich and Eric Anderson. Jonathan Ehrich is an Xbox researcher. He is basically the person we go to if we want to know what our audience is thinking about our game. Eric Anderson is our associate product director. He's actually one of the main people who makes decisions about how we respond to user feedback. Once we've gotten the feedback, what do we do about it in the game? So, Jonathan, kicking us off here. When is the right time to use a survey in particular to get answers from the audience, as opposed to the other options we have, like reading telemetry data or, doing an internal playtest with just people at the lab?
Yeah, a lot of that kind of boils down to like two things, I guess. One of them is, a combination of sort of like where a game is in development or how much time we want to be spending on things. It's not that once a game is launched, we stop caring, but when a game is in development, it just needs so much attention that's where a lot of our time gets focused. And then the other half of it is just like what the team actually wants to know, right? So a lot of the time, if a team wants to know, like, especially early in development, there will just be basic questions like, can someone play this game? Who cares if it's fun or not? Just like, are they physically capable of doing it? Can they figure out how our inventory works? Can they figure out how our incredibly complicated control scheme works with like 5 different types of attacks, some of which require pressing 3 buttons at the same time, right? And so for studies like that, for questions like that, we'll often do what we call a usability study, where a user researcher will work with someone one-on-one, and I'll bring them into the lab or meet them over Discord. I'll have them play the game, and I'll come up with some specific tasks I might want them to do, and I'll just watch them play the game and be like, okay, now can you go destroy a play card? If we were doing something for State of Decay. And then sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. And sometimes either way, I still get to sit there and go like, sure, they figured out how to do it, but they couldn't use a grenade to do it because they couldn't figure out how to throw a grenade or something like that, right? And so I guess that's that. Another thing we'll do is often with games in development is we'll bring larger groups of people in and we'll have them play a little less handheld. Once we're a little more confident people can figure out how to play the game on their own, we might have them play the game for a couple hours, and then that's a point at which we would have them do a survey in that sort of more controlled lab environment or moderated remote environment, and be able to say like, how fun is this game? What do you think about the pacing of this game over those couple hours? Did you feel like, does the story make sense? And then with a game that's, especially with a game like State of Decay 2 that's already out, the fact that you have this PTR unlocks a lot of opportunities for us, because that makes it a lot easier for us to get into a situation where we can say like, well, we know people know how to play State of Decay 2 because they're already doing it. We know there's a lot of people who enjoy playing State of Decay 2 because they're already doing that. Now we want to look at like these specific changes that the team wants to make. And so when those changes are sort of earlier on, a little more janky, that might be a point where we're like, okay, we don't want to make like our fans play this because we want our fans to like us. So we'll make people who work in the studio play it instead because we don't care if they like us. They have to do a job. So that's when we might run like internal studio play tests, and we'll give some early feedback to that, and they'll be able to say like, oh, here's something I think people will really love. Here's something I think people will really hate. And we can do like some first pass feedback on that. And then once we've had a chance to get a little more iteration and polish in, then we might be a point at which we want to put it out in the public test realm. And then we can say like, hey, this is going to be on here for a couple of weeks, right? We don't, especially again, for a game like State of Decay 2, like most changes, sure, someone can play with them for an hour or two, but that doesn't really tell you anything about how it really affects the game, because so much of this game is deeper, longer gameplay than that. And so being able to give people a couple weeks, several weeks to be able to play the game before they might fill out a survey for us can be so rewarding, because then we can really understand how it's impacting the meta and the real gameplay of the game.
So, Eric, how do you actually figure out what questions need to be answered about a particular feature that you're working on? Like, how do you work that out?
I want to do a quick note on the
Oh yeah.
previous thing. Also, because I think there's some insight from our side of things as well about when we want to have a survey around stuff. It often depends on the feature and the kind of the complexity of the feature, um, and kind of how many moving pieces there are and how much uncertainty there is about how things will play out. Um, for example, something like the forever communities is kind of a more solid, like scoped piece of work essentially, where we kind of know the limit of its impact, and there's a lot of smaller questions around that, like in terms of like UX and stuff like that, and a lot of stuff that we can kind of answer internally that we're like, okay, we can play with that and kind of get the kind of feedback we need. um, but then there's bigger changes that affect a lot of different systems that can have a lot of emergent outcomes that you know we won't know about until it really gets in the hands of a lot of people. That's like when we really are like, okay, this is really complex and we're going to need player feedback. Like that's kind of one of the things we also look at when deciding what we want feedback on. Also, when it's especially qualitative feedback, we want like, is this fun? Like there's usability is definitely something like we can kind of look at and be like, this is just confusing how this works, and internally we can do that kind of feedback. But when just in terms of just saying, is this fun, is this engaging, like that is definitely when you want to turn to the fans, and that's typically when we are very unsure about that part of it. That's when we turn to something like a survey in the PTR. um, in terms of your other question,
I mean,
which
it was
is
really relevant to what you just said. You could have
yeah,
used that as your answer.
but sure. But in terms of like figuring out what questions we actually ask, largely, I mean, a good baseline to start from for us is when we are, going into a feature, we have a set of goals in mind, like things that we're trying to accomplish with the feature. And so that's kind of that's always a good place to start from. It's like, okay, what are the goals that we have with this feature? And then, basically ask questions around those to make sure we're actually achieving the goals that we set out to achieve. So just turning those goals into kind of questions, and whatever nuance we need around that. Sometimes it really depends too, if we have specific things about like the implementations, the kind of the solution that we actually used. If we have certain uncertainties about certain parts of it where we're not sure if this part's going to be confusing or not, we might have specific questions around that. And often, like when we have like multiple rounds of like PTR or feedback, and a lot of it's comes from like we're addressing things from, say, a previous survey. So previous rounds of feedback, we'll get, if some problems come up, we try to address it. And so now we'll have some new kind of questions like, okay, did we actually address those problems? So a lot of times previous feedback can drive the questions where we're trying to just make sure that we actually, solve the problems we are trying to solve in this new round of changes. So yeah, it really depends. But and a lot of times just what uncertainties we have about, the approach we took, because again, things change when they're in the hands of a lot of people. Like we play it and we understand the systems and everything. So it's very different when we play it. And so there's just a certain set of uncertainties. Like, well, what does this actually feel like for people who don't know the systems because they didn't help develop them and stuff like that?
Yeah, it's really hard to separate what you know from what the player knows. When you're trying to judge your own work, it's impossible to really be like somebody who completely doesn't understand the feature and has to learn it from scratch. You always know a little bit too much to be able to be useful to yourself unless you go to somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I think using your kind of goals as a baseline is a good place to start, because then it's just like, are we achieving this thing we set out to achieve? And then giving them some room to kind of give some more nuance there is always great, I think.
Yeah,
so I always like the open-ended kind of questions, where instead of just rating something, like get a little more of a description. Like those I really enjoy because it lets people elaborate a lot on that stuff, where it's like, okay, not only are we achieving this goal, but like in what ways are we failing? Because that's also a huge part of it. It's like, if you find, okay, we're not achieving this goal, but how come? Like what parts are failing? Like that's a hard thing to suss out. So, and a lot of times that'll be how we also determine new questions, is like, a problem will come up, and then we're not sure of the answer. We're like, okay, so people are having a problem with this area of the game, but we're not sure specifically what problems there are within there that's causing them to feel this way. And so then we'll have more nuanced questions we'll want answered, so we can have further understanding of a previous question. So it kind of snowballs into future kind of surveys.
Yeah, so it kind of, it kind of underscores the fact that, there's a lot of, when you're making suggestions for a game, a lot of the time, it's just, well, I think this would be neat. This sounds like a neat, fun experience. And when we're having ideas for the game, sometimes it's just, for us, it's also like, oh yeah, I think this would be neat. But that's not enough. It's like when you're talking about defining your goals, you have to have a much more coherent sense of like, oh no, this is actually what this feature will accomplish meaningfully in the game, or this is what we intend for it to accomplish, so that we can then judge if we're doing it right. Because if we just go in thinking, oh, this will be neat, then we don't even know what survey questions to ask at that point. Because like, is it neat would be the only survey question, and we wouldn't really learn anything meaningful.
It's really easy to focus on what's neat as opposed to a goal. It's easy to get sidetracked a lot with shiny things. We're creative people in general. I think we see shiny things and we go for it. So you definitely need some kind of process to keep you focused on what you're actually trying to achieve.
So Eric bringing up all these sort of different kinds of questions we might want to ask actually kind of raises another question that I've got for Jonathan, which is how do you know if a survey is too long? Like, is it possible to ask so many questions that you're getting diminishing returns? Like, talk about like the length of a survey.
Oh, yeah. It is 100% possible for a survey to be too long. The appropriate length of a survey, honestly, is as short as you can get away with. So team, whenever we're planning out a survey, we talk with the team about what questions they have, what they want to figure out. And one, teams always have more questions than we will have room to answer. Two, we always, on the UR side, always want to dive more into understanding the answer to those questions than anyone is actually reasonably willing to spend at their keyboard or filling out a survey on their phone. And so we try and figure out, what the priorities are, what are the most important questions, and then just kind of aim for a perfect length of as few questions as we can ask while answering the most important questions and actually being confident in what we get.
And I imagine that knowing the goals, like Eric was talking about, is probably really key to sort of figure out which questions are the high priority questions to ask and which ones are just anytime somebody asks me, oh, hey, do you have any questions for the audience about this? I'll always be like, yeah, I have 900 questions about what the audience is asking. But so I imagine that what Eric's talking about, really being focused on what goals you have, what you're trying to accomplish, can probably help you narrow that down.
Exactly. I think the most important questions are always those that align with the most important goals, and the goals in general. And then what are the things that we can ask that make sure that feedback is actionable, right? So when we are looking at an update, we could easily just ask a list of questions like, here's 5 new features in this update. Is it better or worse? Is it a clear upgrade? Yes or no? And then we can come back to the team and be like, 80% of people don't like this feature, and they'll be like, why? And I'll be like, oh, guess I should have asked them about that, huh?
Yeah, that makes sense. So there's kind of pressures pushing either direction, wanting the survey to be longer and shorter, and you got to find that perfect balance point, which I imagine experience probably just helps you figure out where that balance point is.
Oh, absolutely. I'm not going to be able to name anything off the top of my head, but there are definitely sorts of questions that when I'm starting to work on a survey, I'm just I could ask this now, but I won't, because I know I will get a completely useless answer from every single person.
I think your comment about making sure they're questions that are actionable, I think that's a great one, because that's something we've talked sometimes we open source to the team, what kind of questions we want to ask, and the team will come up with a ton of questions. And I think something you specifically are really good about doing is well, how would you actually act upon that? With that data, what would you do? And there's a lot of questions where you know what? I don't know what we would do. It's interesting to know, but we wouldn't be able to do anything with it. And so if you can't really do anything with the answer, then that's a pretty good indication that it should probably be cut.
Absolutely.
That makes a lot of sense.
We can all be intensely curious about what would happen if State of Decay 2 involved, oh God, what's the most absurd thing I can think of? Aliens coming from the planet Earth and rescuing them from the zombies and becoming a PvP game. I'm
something that
intensely
we are
curious
not
what
saying
people
we're
would
going
think
to do,
about that,
audience.
because it sounds fascinating. I don't know that anybody's going to actually then go, oh, people love that idea. Let's do that right now.
Yeah. So before we move on to sort of questions about interpreting the data, we've actually got some questions coming from the audience about that. So we'll want to move on to that subject real quick. I have one more question about sort of like the initial setup of a survey, which is how do you get a representative sample of an audience? Like, how do you know either, how do you make sure you get, the right people answering the survey, or if you can't, get a completely representative sample of audience members, how do you compensate for that? So I guess we'll start with the first question. Like, how do you try to achieve a representative sample of audience members and get like the right people answering the questions that really will inform us for the audience?
So it'll work slightly differently in different contexts. So, if I'm running a study remotely or in the lab, one of the first conversations I have with teams at the beginning of development of a product is like, who's going to want to play this game? Right? Like, ultimately, one of the reasons that we know a game is a good idea is that people will want to play it. Because if people won't want to buy the game, if they won't want to play it on Game Pass, then kind of what's the point? And one of the ways we often sort of turn that audience definition to something that's easy to understand is having conversations about games that they think are likely to be competitors, or games that might be really good examples of comparisons for specific features or ideas that the game is working with. And so when I'm recruiting people for a lab study, the most simple thing I might do is just use that list to sort of define a genre for the game, right? Like State of Decay 2, I could say it's an action adventure game, but that's not quite right. And that's going to get me a lot of people who aren't going to be interested in this game. And so instead I can put together a list of different games that sort of encapsulate different aspects of the experience we want to be able to pay attention to, and be like, okay, I need to find some people who play this game and that game and the other game.
Okay, so you use references to other games to sort of figure, okay, I'm going to go talk to it. I'm going to go find and talk to the audience of this game, and that will tell me useful information about the audience of this perspective game.
Yeah. And the hardest part of that I have found is there is always one game on the list that is more popular than every other game. And so it'll be like, okay, we're making this game with like some stealth elements and some platforming elements, and I'm like, oh, okay, so I'll put Assassin's Creed on the list, and then I'll go into the lab and be like, got a lot of people who play Assassin's Creed today and not people who play any other type of game I want to cover.
That makes sense.
So trying to make sure to balance that, or like talk to the people in recruitment about being like, okay, we want some people who play Assassin's Creed, but not too many.
So one of the major, groups of people that we go to run these surveys is people who play in our public test realm,
Exactly.
which is, that's kind of a very specific audience. And I wonder, is there a difference between the audience of the public test realm compared with the broader audience of the game? And like, how do we, if we're getting most of our feedback from that subset of the audience, how do we think that translates into, making decisions about the entire audience of the game?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that boils down to the grain of salt, as it were. Mm-hmm. So, we know that people who play in the public test realm are kind of by definition, they're more passionate about State of Decay than other people who are playing the game, right? There's people who, are fans of the game, enjoy the game, but are playing the game like, maybe a couple hours a month at most, or they'll play it like once a year. They'll be like, oh, I'm going to play through this again because I really enjoyed it. Those sorts of people probably aren't signing up for the public test realm. Or if they are, there's just not going to be as many of them as the people who are incredibly hardcore about the game, incredibly excited about the game, are playing it all the time, want to make sure that they have that chance to give feedback about the game. And, I think the most obvious area where you might see a difference between these groups is difficulty. Anytime we run a survey in the public test realm, we're asking, what difficulty mode are you playing? And there will be one person who plays in green, like 3 people, 5 people who are playing in standard. And then it's like, oh, we got a lot of people doing Nightmare and Lethal over here, huh?
I think that's something, like when we talk about this stuff, I think Jonathan and his team will they'll kind of show us the audience breakdown from the PTR compared to the release game. And so seeing like how much heavily it swings, towards the harder difficulties like lethal and nightmare, and then seeing the baseline, like with the live version of the game, how many more people, like how basically most people are playing standard and green. So just seeing the visuals of like the graph breakdown, it gives you a good mental picture of, how different the audiences are. And then that's just something you have to keep in mind when looking at, especially questions around those things like difficulty. If it's something that's kind of could be construed with difficulty, then you have to kind of just know ahead of time that those are going to be heavily biased in the PTR towards harder difficulties, which can be really useful. 'Cause sometimes, like, if you have a question that is kind of around difficulty, and if the PTR is saying it's too hard, then it's probably really too hard.
Yeah.
So like you just take that into consideration when looking at the different questions. Sometimes some questions probably don't really overlap with difficulty that much. And so it's probably pretty representative because it doesn't, it kind of applies to everyone equally, but it just depends on the questions, I think. But like Jonathan said, keeping kind of a grain of salt about what is said and knowing who the specific audience is and how they compare to the larger audience. That's just something we have to do for everything we look at to like be like, okay, yeah, they say it's too easy, but also consider these are the people who like it really, really hard. So how strong of a feeling that is that? Like if they think it's like everyone says it's way, way, way too easy, then maybe it is a little too easy. If they're like it's just about right, then it might be a little too hard actually. So it's just something we have to consider, just knowing the differences in the audience.
Yeah. And then another piece of that is because the PTR or folks filling out PTR surveys are kind of the most passionate about the game. We want to make sure that we can convince them that that we want them to say mean things about the game. Because it's really easy to get feedback that's like, oh, this game is perfect, or oh, this game is perfect except for this one thing that I've been asking for 4 years now. Geoffrey, what the heck?
I got a few people where that's basically my main interaction with them is how come you haven't done the one thing I care about yet?
Exactly. But a lot of the time it can, when you're giving someone a new feature, it's like you're giving them a piece of candy. And they're like, oh, I love candy. And what we really need them to say is like, yeah, but is the amount of salt on that chocolate just right? Could there be more salt? No, seriously, is there enough salt? Okay, let me just dump a bunch of salt on. Is it too salty now? Okay, good. That's what we needed to hear. We'll dial it back.
Well, that actually kind of, the answers to that question really kind of lead us into the next topic we were going to hit, which is, how we interpret feedback.